Welcome to Crosswords, the podcast about practical Christianity. What does it look like to walk in Jesus' footsteps? How do I live in a culture hostile to godliness? These are questions that we'll answer on each podcast as we get our heart and mind on Jesus. All scriptures quoted are from the New International Version. You can follow me on Twitter at kingdom_saint. Walk with the Lord today and be a blessing. Happy Resurrection Sunday to all of you. It's great to be here on this first day of the week and to share with you a message from 1 Kings. Of course, this week we're starting out with the book of Proverbs, part of the books of wisdom. We already read Job, which is considered one of the books of wisdom, and soon we will read Ecclesiastes. Now, where Proverbs deals with general wisdom, like the general rule of wisdom, Ecclesiastes and Job deal with the exceptions of those general rules. So that's how we gain wisdom together, by reading all of them. Soon we will get into the Proverbs, and we need wisdom. Since we stole some knowledge long ago from the Garden of Eden, that is, Adam and Eve, they stole some knowledge that really didn't belong to us from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We weren't ready for that knowledge. It wasn't meant for humankind to be able to distinguish between good and evil. We're not good at it because we allow our hearts to get in the way and our passions to distort real wisdom. So we need real wisdom. God invites us to live with the kind of knowledge that is going to help guide us through this world, that is going to result in life for us, in good things for us while we're here, and in life everlasting. Even the wisest man that ever lived, Solomon, wasn't able to handle the knowledge of good and evil. And if that was him, who was the wisest man who ever lived, and like we know, nobody was like him before or since, except for our Lord Jesus Christ. So if he was not able to handle it, do we really think that we can handle and be guided by wisdom apart from Jesus Christ? Because see, our heart is flawed indeed, as Jeremiah says. The heart is deceitful above all things. It's sick. There is a sickness in our heart that we ourselves are not even able to understand it. But God searches our heart. He examines our mind. He is the one who is able to reward us according to our conduct. And so he invites us to be guided by his wisdom. If we cannot understand our own emotions and thoughts, how we waver from one end of thinking to another, how our feelings tend to fluctuate up and down. Sometimes we wake up, we don't know why we feel what we feel when we wake up. We don't know sometimes why certain thoughts enter our heads. How can we understand anything clearly? The Lord is the one who is able to search our hearts and our minds. He's the one that can lead us away in a way so that we can be rewarded. And he's the only one who selects those with an upright heart to advance his work. He's the one we really need to listen to when selecting men and women to be influential in the kingdom of God in order to further the legacy of the gospel. So when the men of God follow God's advice, we get to see what a wonderful nation can become. In spite of opposition, in spite of pitfalls that the Satan, the accuser, puts into place, God's nation can flourish. And we see that in the example of Solomon as he reigned over Israel. What a height mankind can reach when they follow God's advice and do things according to his ways. God's plans always succeed. And even though Absalom and Adonijah, two such wicked people who tried to usurp authority and tried to throw a monkey wrench into the system, well, God gave us a peek at what a godly earthly kingdom can look like under his rule and under his advice. But there are some things that we need to learn about having the right heart, because even though Solomon started out having the right attitude and the right heart about it, we quickly see how even in his own lifetime, things started to turn. Something happened in Solomon. Even though he was the wisest man, even wisdom could not keep his heart from becoming deceitful. And there is the lesson that we have to learn in all of this. And that's what 1st and 2nd Kings teach us. We only have 3 options here in our life to exercise wisdom or to use it. We either lead using God's wisdom, or we learn to become followers to eventually become leaders, or we just have to get out of the way. And that's what happens here in 1st and 2nd Kings. Of course, we're only doing 1st Kings today. So whether you're young and old, but primarily young people, Solomon's life sets a bar for us to evaluate not only his reign and the influence that he had, but also the rest of the kings in the book. As a matter of fact, David was used as the bar where God judged all the kings by. He said, "You did not follow the ways of my servant David. You were not like David. You didn't have David's heart." And so David kind of became that standard of what it is to have a heart that yearns after God's own heart. But Solomon, in a way, also becomes a bar, but of a different kind. It's what not to do. David set a bar on how to be, but Solomon is like, don't be like Solomon. Even though he started out the right way, don't end up the way that he did. So after much thinking on what to share from the book of Kings, I decided to share with you the significance of the 3 appearances that God had or allowed Solomon to have in his life. God appeared to Solomon 3 different times on 3 different occasions to give him 3 different messages. And we see the progression of how Solomon started out with the right attitude, but then he allowed his heart to rule instead of the wisdom that he asked God to have. And God gave it to him. So in this first appearance, he gives him a promise. 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 5 through 15. We see a young Solomon. Now, even though Solomon says or refers to himself as a child, you might think that he was a little boy, maybe 13, maybe 15, maybe 16, but that was not the case. He was probably between 20 or 30 years old at the time of this first appearance. But we can see that he was confronting the pressures of governing and ruling. And it was something that weighed heavily on him, and it didn't corrupt him. The power at that point in his life and all that his father had given him didn't corrupt him. He actually had a humble heart. He thought of himself not as wise in his own eyes, but as somebody open to direction. And that is the attitude that God blessed in Solomon. See, as young people, we need to see that we have our whole lives ahead of us. And we need a lot of wisdom and a lot of insight in order to take steps that we know are going to end up being blessed. And that's what the book of wisdom, especially the Proverbs, teach us. It kind of lays those steps before us so that we can learn to be guided by the wisdom of God. And so all these pressures lay on Solomon, and God, in one of these rare instances, he asks Solomon to ask him for whatever he wants. So in this one occasion, we have God almost operating like the genie in a bottle. Ask for your 3 wishes. Apparently, God knew that Solomon was humble in heart, and so he was open and testing him to see what he would ask for. And in chapter 3 of 1 Kings, verse 9, Solomon lays down his request. He says, "Give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people, to distinguish between right and wrong, for who is able to govern this great people of yours?" Solomon knows he's not able to distinguish between good and evil. That's where the humility is shown. He didn't act like his son later did. Remember Rehoboam? He acted like a know-it-all, and he eventually reaped the consequences of that. But Solomon here had a different heart when he was young. He knew he was not able to rightly discern, and that in and of itself is wisdom. to accept that. So he requests to be able to discern correctly and govern justly. He expressed a desire to distinguish between right and wrong, which is the main problem that we have as human beings since knowledge of good and evil was stolen from the Garden of Eden. Not knowing how to distinguish because our heart gets in the way. Solomon knew he had this problem, and his humility is shown by petitioning God and asking him for this request. That is something worth of imitating. That is a great way to start out, and God was very pleased with that request from Solomon. And we read what God answers him in verses 11 through 14. He said, since you've asked for this, and not for long life or wealth. I mean, think about you. What would you ask God if God said, okay, what do you want? I'll give you whatever you want. What do you want? Maybe some of us are tempted to say money, right? That's one of the first things we want. Money, power, fame, influence. Maybe you don't call it fame, but you call it influence. But Solomon's humility here was expressed in what he requested. And God saw in his heart that that was a good attitude. He said, you haven't asked for long life or wealth for yourself, nor have asked for the death of your enemies, but for discernment in administering justice. I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. Solomon was unique in that. Moreover, I'll give you what you have not asked for, both wealth and honor, so that in your lifetime you will have no equal among kings. And if you walk in obedience and keep my decrees and commands as your father David did, there's the standard, I will give you a long life. So we see God's promise divided in three different ways. One of the promises was, Solomon, you're going to be unique. There's going to be no one else like you before or after. The second level of his promise guaranteed that in his lifetime, he would have no equal among kings when it came to wealth and honor. And the third one was an if-then. If you continue to walk, if you keep this up, this attitude, then I'm going to bless you with long life. So Solomon is granted these things, and yes, he remains to this day incomparable in his wisdom and his discerning heart. But he was also given all these things that he didn't ask for. So what's the practical application for us in this first appearance between God and Solomon? I think that the practical application is no matter what stage you are in life, we need to tame our heart. We have to be humble. We have to accept that we don't know everything. We have to accept that we need to remain open to be led by wisdom. Don't think you know it all. Always leave yourself open to direction so that you can learn to acknowledge when God is giving you direction and learn to distinguish between God giving you direction and your heart leading you astray. You're going to need to know the difference for the rest of your life. And so Solomon started out the right way by acknowledging that, and you can see that God blessed him in this venture. So what was the result of that? Well, the best of times. We read all the way here, almost unto chapter 8 of 1 Kings. Everything was going great for Solomon at this time. He grows in reputation, he grows in wealth, he grows in wisdom, just like God promised him. Prosperity, peace is ushered because of one man's request, because of one man's desire to want to do what is right. A whole nation is blessed, and not just the whole nation, but we know that other nations that came to seek Solomon's wisdom received blessings as well because of this. What influence you can have when you are humble before the Lord and you seek direction. His wisdom is shown in that merciful judgment that he issued between the mothers of the baby who died and the baby who was kept alive in 1 Kings chapter 3. Wisdom is shared also in academies, in scholarships. Everybody came to hear what Solomon had to say about botany, zoology, entomology, physics, all kinds of things. God gave him wisdom. He became sort of the repository and the library of knowledge and wisdom for the whole world at the time. And also there were many public works and beatification projects all over Israel, from palaces to houses to reservoirs and gardens, fortresses and cities, and of course, the temple of the Lord. So Solomon builds the temple. He initiates it. He offers sacrifices on it. The Lord's smoke fills the temple, giving Solomon a sign that he accepted it and sanctified it. And so around this time is when God appears a second time before Solomon. But in this second time, we kind of notice that his tone has changed a little bit when he speaks to Solomon. The temple, the palace had been built. Solomon had just dedicated the temple, as I said. He made this long prayer before the Lord. He bowed down before him. But something had changed in Solomon. Something had just started to change. Now, this is how the Lord starts out. He says, I've heard the prayer and plea you have made before me. I have consecrated this temple, which you have built by putting my name there forever. My eyes and my heart will always be there. But then there was a warning following that. If you or your descendants turn away from me and don't observe my commands and decrees I have given you, and you go off and serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land I have given them, and I will reject this temple I have consecrated for my name. Israel will then become a byword and an object of ridicule among the people. The tone of God changed a bit here. What happened? Was God seeing something different in Solomon's heart? This is about 20 years later, by the way. There's about 20 years between the first appearance of God and the second one. Maybe some pride, maybe some arrogance had already crept into Solomon's heart. Had his knowledge puffed him up due to losing sight of love and mercy? Had the fame that he had begun to erode his heart even more? So there's a practical application for us too at this point. We really want to become aware of our weaknesses. This is something that Solomon didn't pay attention to. In all the wisdom that God had given him, he kind of lost sight that he still had some weaknesses, that he still better be humble before the Lord and accept instruction and correction, as he says to do in Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and all these other books that he wrote. Be aware of where you fall short. Be aware of that. Be sober about that. Listen to those who know you well. Sometimes we only want to seek advice from those whom we think are going to agree with us. And so we deceive ourselves in the process. Listen to those who know you well, meaning starting with mom and dad. They know your flaws. They know you well. Listen to their advice. If you have an important decision to make, something that you're considering, tell it to them. Ask them about these things. These are the people that really love you. Remember, one of the Proverbs is an enemy multiplies kisses. But the person that you love, the wounds from a friend, can be trusted. Don't give free rein to your temptations and passions, because they will be the death of you. And we're going to see that's what's going to happen to Solomon. Now, after this warning from God in his second appearance, things started to go from bad to worse for Solomon. The character erosion in Solomon is displayed in 4 different ways. It's displayed in his preoccupation with materialism. He starts to accumulate a lot of things, a lot of gold, a lot of silver, a lot of horses, a lot of possessions, things that he doesn't even need. Who needs 10 cars? Who needs 10,000 chariots? Right? Who needs 50 pairs of underwear? Right? So this preoccupation with material things is one of the ways that we can see how his character begins to erode. Also, he becomes, we're all sensual to a point because we live in a body, but he starts becoming preoccupied. He starts letting his sensuality leading him. And Solomon loved women. He was a Don Juan of his time. We can read about that in Song of Solomon. No offense to you, Juan, not a Don Juan like you. But if you know who Don Juan is, then you know what I'm talking about. So he marries all kinds of women. He had 700 wives and 800 concubines. More than what is going on here. He kept the biggest harem ever, and all these women eventually caused him to forget about God. His sensuality became an idol in his life. All these things, that materialism became an idol, sensuality became an idol, and haughtiness. He became very proud. He did not listen to advice. The wise man who said, listen to advice, he himself ended up not listening to him, was deceived by his heart. So see, not even wisdom can protect you from your deceitful heart unless you remain humble and willing to be led by God. And all these things, of course, ended up becoming idolatry to him, which is the same thing as superstition in our view of things today. If I were king, I would have done things a little differently. If I were in the Word of God as king of Israel, I think I would have remembered, or maybe some of the prophets would have reminded me of what it said here in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 14 through 17, where it says, when you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you and have taken possession of it and settled it, and you say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us. See, God already knew what was going to happen. You have to understand that God knows things that you don't know about yourself. That's why you have to listen to him. God already had given them a formula here to protect them from what was about to happen. So if they would have listened, things would have turned differently. But they chose to ignore the wisdom of God. And so we have 1st and 2nd Kings written so that we can learn from their mistakes. We know history repeats itself. Well, only for the fool. But for the wise, it doesn't have to repeat itself. It says here, be sure to appoint over you a king the Lord chooses. He must be from among your fellow Israelites. Don't place a foreigner over you, one who is not an Israelite. And the king must not acquire a great number of horses for himself or make people return to Egypt to get more of them. For the Lord has told us, don't go back that way again. That's precisely what Solomon did. He got a great number of horses. Guess where? Guess where from? From Egypt. Just like it said here not to do. It says, he must not take many wives. Totally opposite Solomon did, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver or gold. Well, I guess Solomon must have forgotten this, because he broke every one of these commands. So by the time the Lord appears to Solomon a third time, he's gotten to a point of no return. And that's where we don't want to end up. We don't want to end up now God saying, okay, well, you know what? Since you didn't listen, now this is going to happen. Now it's too late. This is what's going to happen to you. We don't want to be in a place where we've ignored those who love us. We've ignored those that are older than us spiritually. And now we're before them, not to get encouragement, not to get more wisdom, but to get the consequences. Now this is what you have to suffer. That's not a place where you want to be. But that's the place where Solomon was in this third appearance in 1 Kings chapter 11. God didn't have any advice for him. God just had, this is what's going to happen. These are the consequences for you. Solomon wasn't really listening at this point, and it's such a shame that a man who so humbly desired discernment and wisdom ended up in such a tragic display of folly. It's a lesson we really need to take seriously. It says here, the Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who appeared to him twice. Now, you may be tempted to read these words and say, oh, why did God have to become angry? Why couldn't just Solomon do whatever he wanted to do? Well, God didn't become angry because Solomon wasn't listening to him. God was angry for Solomon. God cared about Solomon. When your parents get upset because you don't listen to them, you might think, oh, don't get upset, Mom. I'm the one who's deciding to do this. We get upset because we love you. We get upset because we would wish for you not to cause harm to yourself. We're zealous for you. And so we understand the Lord getting upset when people don't follow him. We as parents understand. But you young people, children, if you haven't had children, you don't get it yet. This is something you must remain open to, this kind of direction. Because one day you will be sitting in that place and you will say, they were right. They were right. But you don't want to say it in such a way that there's no more hope for you, do you? You want to say it in such a way like, oh man, they were right. Let me make sure I get my act together because they were right. You don't want to say it in a way like, oh, woe is me, they were right, and now I can't do anything about it. That's not the place you want to be. And so that becomes the lesson here for us in this third appearance. He got distracted by materialism, sensuality, fame, and instead of allowing his knowledge to make him wise, it made him a fool. Corinthians says, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. If you want to make sure that knowledge doesn't corrupt you, practice love. That's what's going to mitigate arrogance from developing in your heart because of knowledge. So God says to Solomon, since this is your attitude, you don't want to listen, you think you know it all, you think you have it all. Well, that's your attitude. You haven't kept my covenant, my decrees. I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Paul writes about it in this way in Romans 1, 22 and 23. He says, since they knew God, but neither glorified him as God, nor gave thanks to him, in their thinking they became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. This is what happens when we forget the wisdom of God. Because the wisdom of the world, the knowledge of good and evil that we stole from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, what it causes in us is for our thinking to become futile. That means empty. That means we're thinking about a lot of things, but it doesn't accomplish anything in our life. It doesn't really help us. It doesn't really turn into wisdom. And that's why the Proverbs are there, to make sure that the knowledge that we're getting is a knowledge that results in wisdom, in a life that gives glory to God. So that our hearts, which are always going to be with us, don't end up turning dark, as it does happen with people who don't acknowledge God. Verse 22 says, they claim to be wise, but they're really fools. Solomon claimed to be wise, but in the end, he proved that he was foolish. So we have to be careful not to fall into this trap. I like what Corinthians says here. Those who think they know something do not yet know as they ought to know. When I was young and in college, I memorized this because I didn't want to be one of those casualties of arrogance and folly. Because I had the tendency to think I knew it all. I was a know-it-all. I read books, I knew stuff. People asked me questions, I gave them answers. I thought I know it all. But then I said, you know what? It's most important to learn to love God than to think I know something. This would have protected Solomon from his folly. This would have protected Solomon from his downfall. It's more important to learn to love God and do what pleases him than to try and know stuff. Solomon is the example right there. So which pill would you take? We only have two choices in life, really. The truth that God's love brings you because he loves you, or how you decide you want to interpret the world in your life. That's it. There is no other interpretation. You can either choose God or you can choose the world. You choose. But God here is trying to give you a help. Choose wisdom. Love life. You love life? Choose wisdom. You want to be wise? Fear God. That's what the Proverbs are all about. Knowing something is not as important as learning to love God. And of course, that involves getting to know God in order to learn to love God. That's the knowledge that is worth something. The knowledge that we get from the Word of God. So the lesson here is don't think you know as you should, or don't think you know as you should know, because there's always room for growth. And you won't ever be able to acquire all the knowledge of the world anyway. Solomon, in all his wisdom and all the knowledge that he had, didn't really even know everything that had to be known. Because as the Proverbs will declare, knowledge and wisdom come from the Lord. And He gives it to those who humbly request it, as we saw He did for Solomon himself. Now look at what God tells Solomon. We haven't finished reading what He told him in this third appearance. He said, "Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I won't tear the kingdom away from you during your lifetime. I'm going to tear it out of the hand of your son." Because God knew what Rehoboam was going to be like. "Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but I will give him one tribe for the sake of my servant David." Notice what he's saying there. Notice what I have highlighted here. For the sake of David, not Solomon. For the sake of David. Because David was the man after God's own heart. So God remembered David and continued to bless his house, even though Solomon was not worthy of the blessing, and certainly not Rehoboam. But because of a promise God made to David, and for the sake of the one who loved God with all his heart, He blessed the other generations and took it easy on him. He was merciful with them. Not for Solomon's sake, not for Rehoboam's sake, but for the sake of David. David was the worthwhile mediator of his legacy because he sought to please God. He sought God's heart. Solomon lost that appeal. Even though he started as a humble man, he no longer could appeal to God on that basis because his heart had become proud. And so David became the standard by which God judged all the kings after him. Your actions not only have consequences for you, but for all those around you, even for people that you haven't gotten to know yet, like your children's children or your children's children's children. Be aware of that. And so here we come to the practical application of this third appearance. Don't allow knowledge to become your idol. Not knowledge or anything else that stole Solomon's heart from the Lord. Could be sensuality, could be materialism, fame, love of money. All these things are idols that are not going to help you live in wisdom. They're actually going to become distractions and thorns in your way and become a downfall. You need to learn to purge all these idols away from your heart and mind. And the only way we can ensure that happening is by developing a heart that seeks God. Nothing else you will pursue will protect you, but will be the death of you, except for the love of God. So unfortunately, after this third appearance, the results for Solomon just became doom and condemnation. And the remainder of chapter 11, the final words about the reign of Solomon, they're very sad, very pathetic indeed, what happened. 1 Kings 11, verse 14 through 40, we see God starting to raise adversaries against Solomon. That could have been easily avoided. And so the rest of his days, Solomon just spent trying to hold on to his throne until the day of his death. And after that, we have this whole account in Kings that's very, very sad. The kingdom is divided, and the northern kingdom, the tribes of Israel, no good or worthwhile king ever came from that tribe. But from the tribe of Judah and Bethlehem, which stuck with the lineage of David, there were a few good kings, a few kings that, as God says, went after David and, did things in the manner David did and loved God. So that was good. In 1 Kings, we don't have many direct references to the Messiah, but the Messiah does make mention of some events in First Kings. Just like we see here when Jesus is talking, he talks about the Queen of Sheba. Now there's a whole chapter dedicated to the Queen of Sheba and the kind of influence that Solomon in all his glory had even on nations around him. And so Jesus mentions, talking about judgment, he says, the Queen of Sheba will rise at the judgment with this generation. Jesus is talking about the generation that was there before him. Now, the Queen of Sheba is separated from that generation by many hundreds of years. But he says she came from the ends of the earth to listen to Solomon's wisdom. And now something greater than Solomon is here. So at judgment, the Queen of Sheba is going to tell all those people who didn't listen to Jesus, you bunch of fools. You don't recognize who you had before you. I recognize who I had before him. And he is much less than the one you had before you. And so let those words echo amongst you today. Because right now, we still have someone greater. We have someone greater, Jesus Christ. And for us to ignore these words of the Messiah, the words of the resurrected one, because we live in a very blessed time, post-cross, where we can look back and say, you know what? All these events happened. The Messiah came. He suffered on a cross. His life was full of many evidences, of many miracles that proved who he says that he was, because no one else had come like this before him. Just like Solomon, right? No one had the wisdom of Solomon before him. And after him, no one was the same. Well, guess what? Jesus has done something similar, but to a greater degree. No one was like Jesus before he came, and no one has been like him afterwards, because he is the Messiah. And so we live at a time where we can look back and say, wow, someone great was here. And someone left a legacy for us to follow, left words of wisdom for us to take to heart and let us guide us. So if we foolishly ignore that, on judgment, not only will the Queen of Sheba rise up, but many others who saw Jesus and condemn us for not paying attention to someone that was greater. And we need to listen very carefully to what he's saying there. Jesus' noble and good heart is clearly seen in how he left those ivory palaces of heaven to meet us here in the grime and the stench of the wickedness of humanity. He lived perfectly fulfilling God's law in view of becoming that substitutionary sacrifice for us, because we needed a representation. We needed a mediator, because we had stolen that knowledge of good and evil and think that we know what we're doing with it. But to our own condemnation, we know nothing of that. And yet God in his mercy interceded for us while we were still his enemies. He died because we don't know what we're doing. And he looked at us like sheep without a shepherd. He has mercy on us. And he still looks to provide a way out from the deception of our heart into true wisdom. So those who follow in his footsteps, we get a chance to recreate humanity. But to do it right this time, to do it by saying no to our passions of the flesh, by setting aside the things that might become an idol for us, and by giving ourselves wholly of heart and mind into the footsteps of Jesus. And that's what baptism symbolizes. It's the point in time when we're ready to accept that, you know what, yes, we did follow in the footsteps of our father Adam and sought a knowledge that was not meant for us, sought a way to live a life that was not really what God made us for. Well, I reject that. I reject what Adam and all of his descendants have done, because they haven't had good results up to this point. I know that for a fact. And yet there's only one who has really conquered death, and that is Christ. I want to follow in his footsteps, because I want to be able to conquer death. And I not only want to conquer death, but I want my life in the here and now also to have good results in keeping with what pleases God. And that's what we do when we get baptized. Baptism, the water symbolizes us participating in Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. So just like he was raised, we are also raised to newness of life. And we can begin to do that today. Jesus said, "Why do you worry about clothes? See how the flowers of the field grow. They don't labor or spin, yet I tell you, not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed as one of these." So Jesus, again, taking something that maybe impresses people, the robes that Solomon had with the gold threads and the beautiful patterns. He says, man, that don't even come close to the petal of a rose. And you've seen the petals of flowers, right? How soft they are. It's like miraculous, soft and fragrant. But they don't last long. They don't last long at all. He says, that's how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today, tomorrow thrown into the fire. How much more will he clothe you? How much more can we expect from God when we follow in his ways? Let us be people of faith. What patterns are you weaving in your life at this moment? How are you taming your heart? Are you taming your heart, or are you letting your passions control you? Are you letting them distract you to the left or to the right? Are you getting caught up in the patterns of the world? Because that's what happens. Self-control is required to leave a legacy of wisdom and of worship of the one Lord God. One that will ensure peace and longevity for you and for your successors. A heart that turns away from the living God will certainly ensure a legacy of trouble, sorrow, and doom for you and your successors. That's what 1 Kings teaches us. 1 and 2 Kings, by the way. You can read all about this pattern in the books of 1 and 2 Kings. Those who are obedient to the Lord are blessed. Those who disobey, they receive judgment. So let's not fall into the sin of Rehoboam, thinking that he knew what was best, throwing out the advice of the people that are older than you just because you think you know better. Instead, seek to develop in yourself a heart that yearns for God, just like David, so that you can know the blessings of God. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you very much for listening. I hope the Lord gave you insight into conforming to Jesus with today's message. I always appreciate feedback. You can send me your thoughts, musings, and comments directly through the Anchor app. You can also contact me on Twitter at kingdom_saint. Walk with the Lord today and be a blessing.